Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast, the series where I speak to people who can help us to understand the risks of human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate them. On this episode, I'm returning to the topic of failure. If we want to get better at mitigating human risk, then we need to understand why and when things go wrong, as well as when they go right. A recent piece of research from Queen Mary University of London gave me the perfect excuse to ask my guest, Dr. Magda Osman, onto the show. I saw Magda give a lecture in 2019, and since then have been looking for a good reason to invite her on. Magda specialises in what she describes as taking a critical eye to well-accepted views and challenging the status quo. So exactly the kind of thinking that can help us further the human risk mission. I'm a huge proponent of using behavioural interventions to influence human decision-making and behaviour. And in her latest piece of research, Magda and colleagues looked at published failed behavioural interventions across all kinds of areas that impact society, from healthy eating and organ donation to tax compliance. And what they showed was that while any type of behavioural intervention applied in any type of setting could be liable to fail, certain types of intervention were more likely to fail. Current behavioural change programs talk a lot about successes, but it's equally important that we look at failures, because that can help us learn from them and avoid wasting time and money on interventions that are likely to fail. So in our discussion, Magda and I explore the paper and then move on to talk about other behavioural interventions like unconscious bias training. True to her word, Magda brings her critical eye and a great sense of humour. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Magda Osman. Magda, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Hello.
Hello. Absolute pleasure to have you here. And before we get into your research that grabbed my attention, can you tell my listeners a little bit about you and your area of specialism?
There's one main area, so that's decision-making under conditions of risk and uncertainty, and dynamic uncertainty. So when things sort of constantly change, but we're not sure what the reasons behind those changes are. Now, once you go down that route, then that kind of invites a number of other areas of for me, that are of interest, which is control. So, how do you make decisions to generate outcomes predictably over time? Because you're trying to control all manner of things in your life. In the backdrop of trying to make sort of mini assessments of risk and then also trying to reduce uncertainty. So control, agency, causality, how do we learn to associate the things that we do with the things that we observe as outcomes? So that's the kind of general profile of things that I sort of cover. There's more besides, but I mean, those are the kind of core things.
And what grabbed my attention recently, and you were absolutely on my radar before, but what grabbed my attention recently was a piece of research that you just put out that I'll paraphrase, but I'd love it if you could dive into a bit more detail, which kind of says this behavioral science thing is a little bit more complicated, and some of these nudge type interventions that we just assume are going to work actually don't. And so you exposed some of the reasons why some of these things fail. I'm fascinated, one, by the idea of failure and what we can learn from it. But secondly, just the inspiration to write something that is almost saying, well, this discipline's not as simple as you all might have thought, and there's some things you need to think about.
So, yes, there's quite a bit to unpack, but let me put this in context, which is say, let's say that's drawn some attention, or it's been on the radar of a number of people, including the Behavioural Insights team. So I know that they've noticed that that particular piece that you're referring to. But this isn't new from the things that I've done. Right? So, this has kind of been a long, kind of steady slog where I've been making the same noises, which kind of culminate into this one paper, with many sort of authors contributing. The idea behind it is to sort of, you can ask me what the context behind how that came about, in a moment, let's say, but I think there's, what where I come from with that is kind of epistemic humility. So what that means is that, you understand the limitations of the things that you know, and you show humility around that. So, and I'm not someone that's sort of saying, I'm not sort of deliberately antagonistic in sort of saying, look, let's take a step back here and kind of consider what we can learn from things that don't work. Just to kind of attack what actually is being done. I know the difficulties in actually setting up behavioural interventions, but the idea is that rather than just showcase all of the things that apparently work, there's things you can learn from why things don't work in the way that they do, because then you can learn to do things better. So there is enormous value to failure, which is the kind of underlying message of the piece.
There's sort of a shift between people are really complex and they're difficult, and then we get the publication of these books like Nudge that sort of go, oh well, here's a way that you can manage this, and that, there's a tendency out there for people to sort of pick up these books and go, oh right, nailed it now, I now know what I'm doing. And of course, in any other context, that would be a little bit strange if you just read one book and kind of nailed these pieces. And of course, one book is a summation of a whole host of things presented in a certain way, because people don't want to buy books that don't solve problems, not particularly good from a book selling. But it's fascinating that there is this simplification. We all like a nice simplified view of the world, and therefore controlling and understanding human behavior as a sort of simple set of rules about how you can manage that feels convenient and helpful. But reality is a little bit more complex. And what you're doing is exposing some of the weaknesses there of that sort of approach that says this can be just codified down into simple things.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think the thing is sort of, going out there and saying, well, things are a little bit more complex is not helpful. Everybody knows that anyway. So it's not that, if that's the take home, then that's an unfortunate take home, because that's not. The idea is to say, well, given that we know that things are that much more complicated, how can we think about the way in which we go into setting up a behavioural intervention? Nudge is one of many different kinds of interventions that you can use. But you do it in a way where, with the expectancy that it might not work in the way that you intended. It may work. It's just that things will happen inadvertently because of the nature of the context in which, you're implementing these things, which is in the real world. So the idea is to say, well, okay, given that, and actually first principles, which is, well, okay, you set up a hypothesis, then you characterize the context in which you want to trial the intervention and what you expect. But then you want to profile the bigger context, because you'll see that these things interact with each other. There are things in the environment as they exist which interact with what you plan to do to increase, ultimately make better decisions, or encourage people to make better decisions and, behave in ways that are better for them and society in the long run. But you can't, but going into that environment somewhat blind to the other factors that actually are likely to inform what people do is, it's slightly naive. So that's why, we were saying, well, look, actually, if you start to unpick all of the different interventions that there are, where sometimes they go wrong. I mean, it's not only that, the thing that's sort of most staggering that I found was that it's not that they just don't work. They go horribly wrong. Right? They backfire. They actually make things worse than better. So, okay, well, given that, is there any pattern to the kinds of failures? And then this is, in the same ways you would do in any other area of research, to start off with, you want to classify things. So that's why we developed a taxonomy of different kinds of failures, so that, any practitioner going into the world has an idea of what didn't work before in different areas. And one other thing, I think, which is, right, so I get sort of two responses to this is, well, is there a kind of taxonomy of things that generally work? What things must we avoid? And there's unfortunately the answer again is not one which is, you can't just sort of have a lookup table where you say, okay, well, these are the things that always work and these are things that, because it's not going to be like that. It's like human behavior is that much more complicated in relation to the context you see it in. And so if you don't acknowledge that successfully, you're always bound to fail.
The answer to that question, right, about what not to do is don't go looking for that list of things not to do.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I mean, yes, exactly that, right? It's not, but I don't want to sort of present it as a kind of impossible task. Yeah, that's the point of trying to classify all of the things that at least we could see that were published, where things didn't quite pan out the way the researchers or the practitioners are intended, because there are patterns to these things. It's not like you can't know anything at all. It's just that it's not like, okay, if you use a default opt-out system, it's always going to work in all of these contexts. Is it? Well, no, that's not right. I mean, there are particular levers which are more likely to work in some situations than others, and there are particular levers that are more likely to fail in some situations than others. And so, we need to appreciate that. And I suppose one other thing on top of that is, and this is sort of what grinds my gears a bit, is the presentation of the nudges and other types of behavioural interventions in the populace is one where there's an expectancy that these things work and they make us do this positive thing. They make us smoke less or drink less or exercise more and so on. You're overselling here what's actually going on. So let's temper this, because it's an industry now, and so there's enormous amount of money invested and time in using these things, and if you're overselling the success of these things, then you really are overselling, because it's just not like that in the real in the real world, but also in the published literature as well.
It's fascinating because it sort of takes us in territory of replication crisis. And for listeners that aren't aware, this is this thing in particular in social sciences where you say stuff that we tried in a laboratory doesn't replicate again, and this is a crisis. Whereas I would look at it and go, it's not entirely surprising that if you conduct a set of experiments with, say, a bunch of students that you've paid to be there, that doesn't automatically produce the same results if you do exactly the same thing with a bunch of, bankers highly paid bankers in financial services. They're different environments, different people, different pieces. And so what you're highlighting there illustrates that point, which is not every single human being is the same. And not every single set of circumstances in which those human beings find themselves, even if we try and codify them as such. So we talk about somebody being in the office, that might mean very different things for different people according to what job they do. And a lot of what you're saying, I think is sort of interesting because it points in that direction of we gain some insights, we take comfort from those insights because that's what people like doing. And then we just assume that that's a universal rule that applies to everybody. And you're saying, well, it's actually not that simple.
But again, with some caveat here. So it's not like you run let's say you take a standard decision making task which is run typically on undergraduates, and it sort of tells you what level of risk appetite that the population have. And then you run it on some investment brokers, and you say that you see that it's even more exaggerated. You haven't replicated the findings. It's not entirely that. It's that actually in one sense it's even more worrying, which is that you take the same test. Now let's say actually at least where the replication crisis occurred in psychology. I mean, there are multiple replication crises, not just in the social sciences, in the medical sciences as well. So that we're all subject to this, in the sciences. That you can say the context was one where if you're looking at unconscious processes. So this is where the largest problem occurred in terms of replication. So like priming effects, right? So you could be unconsciously primed to behave in a particular way. So something exists in the task setup and you're not consciously aware of it, and it actually influences your behavior. And then when you ask people, then they don't notice the thing that is actually there that might have influenced their behavior. Now, the kind of assumptions that you make about that are very strong, right? Because, you know, if your subject influences that you are not under your control and you're not consciously aware of, then that's quite a worrying thing to sort of, accept. So actually it turned out that many studies in that area could not be replicated, right? So that, evidence to show that there are unconscious influences on your behavior, which, you have to set the bar very high for that kind of finding, because it's also that much more consequential. So if you run the same test on the same population, right? So you run whatever test it is, you run it again in the same undergraduate population, and in a separate lab in another country with a different set of participants, but from the same population, and you find that you can't replicate those findings, it's even more worrying, right? So it's not just that you run it in the lab and you then you don't find it in the field. Right, it's just you run the same test multiple times over on the exact same population, and you don't find the actual, you don't find the same things. You get null effects. So that's one. And the other thing is that, and again, this is highlighted in the paper as well, which is this publication bias, which is that when, and this is, I think, reflective of a sort of kind of much bigger issue around let's actually academia more generally, not just social sciences, which is the strong incentive to publish work that is highly kind of intuitive and catchy. And so when you don't, when those experiments fail, then you don't publish them. And also because the journals are more inclined to publish kind of snazzy, interesting findings rather than kind of failed experiments. So, this is why there was lots of mechanisms that then followed, which is, pre-registering reports and that kind of thing to try to address that. So, it's a big issue, and also one that extends to behavioural change interventions for the same reasons, right? So you want to show that you test a particular nudge in an area like, let's say, charitable donations, right? You want to encourage people to donate more to charity, but the intervention doesn't work at all, or it backfires, actually puts people off, which we actually found in some cases. Then some researchers might not be inclined to publish that finding, or journals would be less receptive to publishing that kind of finding. So that's why you get publication bias, which is you get a disproportionate kind of view of what's going on in the literature, because only the successes get published and rarely do the failures get published. So I can't actually tell you how many things that people have trialed as interventions that have failed because some of those things just aren't published.
And this is a beautiful link back to a few episodes ago where I interviewed someone who's the editor-in-chief of something called the Journal of Trial and Error. And it was exactly designed to counteract this piece. So he said, we're going to publish the stuff that effectively no one else will publish. We're going to publish the failures. So it's a great idea. One of the things he said on the episode was everybody said, that's a great idea. And then we turned to them and said, well, what are you going to provide? Oh, no, I can't put anything in that. So there was this beautiful thing where they've created a construct. It's sort of, on the face of it sounds like a good idea, but the same human dynamics that lead the publishers to only publish that led also some of the researchers. So I think this is a really interesting space. And the bits that I found fascinating in your research was sort of there were two bits that sort of made me smile. I think partly because I was looking for comedic interludes and things that really stood out. One was those backfire pieces that you've alluded to a little bit, but the other one was where things worked out, but not for the reasons you might have thought. Right. So you got the outcome you were looking for, or something directionally but it was nothing to do with you. So you sort of would benefit of circumstances. I wonder if you sort of unpick a few examples of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, so to kind of work backwards, I think with kind of showing humility to the people who are actually doing these things, and report these things, the interventions that they're trialing. The fact that, and this counts in their favor, the fact that they're actually specifying in advance the hypotheses that they want to test, right? So you make a prediction, you think, okay, this intervention I'm going to trial in the context of, let's say, trying to encourage people towards more pro-environmental behaviors, or reducing their home sort of fuel consumption, energy consumption. I think, okay, well, we've made this prediction. We're going to use these kinds of snazzy interventions. Often the kind of social comparison or social norming. So that is, you're told people like you do this kind of thing. And so, the idea is, if that's what everyone else is doing, I should do the same kind of thing because, they're benefiting, so should I. Yeah, and actually what that can do inadvertently is, stimulate reactance, which is that, well, why the hell should I do what everybody else is doing? Like, I don't feel like I want to be like these others, or I don't fit with that group. So, screw you, I'm not going to do that. It kind of backfires in that kind of way. But the value of kind of being precise about the predictions you make and profiling the context in which you're introducing these interventions makes my life easier, because I can then see the connection between what was intended and what the outcome is. You're right to say that actually some of these things happen inadvertently, and that, that you get a positive outcome for entirely the wrong reasons. But you think, well, that's okay, as long as, we know that, so we can learn something about what those inadvertent reasons are. So here's, one of my favorite backfiring effects is, so this was a field study in the US. It was in a US campus, university campus, and it was in multiple waves, which meant that it was kind of multiple, like, hilarious failures. So what they'd done was they'd said, okay, well, we want to try to encourage people to consume less kind of sugary drinks that, are unhealthy for them. So what we'll do is we'll change the proportions of healthy to unhealthy drinks in these drink dispensers across campus. So the idea is that there's more water and fruit juice rather than kind of the sugary stuff. So, okay, well, then we can track sales as a way to see whether that actually works. So it's not, and it's precisely in the spirit of nudge, which is that, the intervention shouldn't prevent you from doing otherwise, right? So if you want to still buy sugary drinks, you can. It's just that, the signals in the environment are, well, maybe you should avoid that and go for the healthy thing. So they set up that. Then the idea is, okay, well, we've got something here, because what we can do is, if we encourage people to buy more water, let's say, or, more healthy drinks, if they keep the bottles, the empty bottles, then what we can do is retrofit the fountains, the drink fountains, the water fountains on campus, so that they can easily fill up these bottles. So one, that's encouraging them to drink more, and then the other is that it's reducing waste, so that, it's pro-environmental behaviours and healthy behaviours. So this was over a long period, over a couple of years. So what they found was actually the sales of sugary drinks went up over rather than go down. So, people actually bought more sugary drinks, and then the other thing is that they also littered more. So, it's kind of a staggering epic fail on both here's the contextual factors, and here's why that might have happened, which is that if you change the ratios, Right, you may not have thought this in advance, but if you'd thought this in advance, you could play around with it and trial it before you sort of, run a full-scale intervention, which is the thing that is desirable is the sugary drinks. Now, if you change the ratio so there's less of them, then it becomes much more desirable because it's seen as slightly rarer. Right, so it's competing with the thing that I'm being signaled to sort of drink, which is the healthy stuff. I'm less reluctant to do that anyway. So the thing that I want is actually made more valuable by being sort of seen as slightly rarer. And the other thing is that in the local area, so not only on campus, but in the actual region itself, there were issues to do with the water purity, right? So there were concerns about the purification plant in that region, which meant that actually the water quality was actually quite poor and people were actually quite suspicious of it. So if you're kind of retrofitting all of the fountains on campus to encourage the people to drink the water that people know through, the newspapers in the local area is suspiciously kind of, polluted, then, it's not a surprise that people think, well, no, I'm not going to actually fill up my bottle of water with the local water, which I know is actually potentially polluted. So, but this is where it's important, right? So the broader context, if you understood that in advance and you looked at it, you would see how it could potentially compete with the virtuous kind of interventions you wanted to introduce. So that's one of my favorite examples because it just really, highlights the need to kind of profile carefully the interventions and also the broader context in which the interventions are introduced so that you know in advance what might be competing with externally the interventions you're trialing.
And as you describe it there, it's fascinating, right? Because none of that is unpredictable. So it's not like, I don't know, a sort of, and I hesitate to say, just sort of talk about COVID as an example of an unpredictable thing, because that again was predictable. But you can sort of see that's a shock to the system. But all of the dynamics that you described there, sort of with a little bit of thought around it, and I recognize hindsight bias is playing a huge part in what I'm saying now, but you could get there. It's not sort of massively counterintuitive that if you reduce the supply of something, demand for it goes up. We know that from other contexts. There's an example of economics working in the real world perfectly. And so I find that kind of it's fascinating because what you've discovered there isn't a sort of great shock horror. It was entirely predictable had you done the piece around it. So to a certain extent, you're almost proving actually that there are, dynamics of human behavior are to a certain extent predictable because that wasn't an unexpected piece, but it's just a case of how you set the intervention up in the first place and thinking around some of these things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you're right that, hindsight sort of allows you to think, well, of course, this, how ridiculous that anyone would have done these things. But again, to sort of show some humility, you think, well, to the extent that I and my authors that sort of worked on this can say, well, look, this is why the value of failures is so important, because you can learn from what wasn't quite so successful and what might have been missed. Right. So the thing is that, well, again, you kind of think about the incentives here, which is you're so if you're trialing these things in the field, it's laborious and it's painful, and you know that it's a bit risky anyway. So the thing is, if you're that motivated to actually try to get it to work, you might be so focused on that you, at the expense of paying attention to other things that might countermand that. So that's why it's saying, well, okay, well, learn from this, right? So this is what's happened before. So as an illustration, just at least kind of profile in a broader sense what other things might actually mean that it won't work. Like, accept the possibility that it might not work, not just focus on the fact that it has to work, right? Because that incentive means that you might be disproportionately focusing only on the things that might likely lead to it working. And that's that's sort of slightly against first principles in science, where you think, okay, well, what's the null effect here? I have to predict the null here, or predict in some cases a backfire, right? So it's not only it's not going to work, it's going to work staggeringly badly in the opposite direction to what I've intended. So accept that might happen.
As you look at the sort of things you discover, where do you take it from here? Because this clearly, and my interest in it is clearly one example of people kind of latching onto this thing and going, whoa, this is where's the next phase of the research piece? Where's your journey take you from here, having created some headlines with what you've discovered here?
My worry is that I'd be preaching to the converted, right? So there'll be some people who have experienced trialing interventions and are just generally sympathetic to considering what the reasons are for things not necessarily working and trying to improve their practices. And there's kind of many consultancies that have since kind of contacted me and said, we do lots of behavioural change, we want to know more about how we can avoid potential failures. So that's useful, but then that's kind of preaching to a converted audience. So two lines of work that we follow is that there's a lot more. It's incredibly effortful trying to find actual published work of things that don't quite pan out, because that's not where we're at, because the machine is so large, the enterprise is so enormous, and people are looking like, I mentioned all of these kind of enormous institutions, right? So there are many government departments that include kind of behavioural insight type interventions, the World Health Authority, the World Bank, the OECD, and so on. These are enormous institutions that are designed to try to, use whatever tools are available. And they aren't showing epistemic humility. They aren't saying, actually, let's take a step back. Let's understand that actually some of these things don't work quite as we intend them to do. And so we need to think a little bit more carefully, so we're not overselling the use of these things and the expectancy that they'll work. Because if we do that, we can figure out ways to make them better, right? So that's one kind of motivation I have, which is, make the noises as loud as possible so people are much more alert to this. Because, it's just inefficient. It's like you're wasting a lot of time and money trialing things and sort of even making false promises. The other is, as I was kind of alluding to, which is it's very effortful trying to find published work where people report the kinds of things that I've just been talking about, and so that we only scratch the surface. And so actually the next step is to sort of try and increase the base of data to work with in two ways. So not just focus on the things that actually fail, but also think about the things that work, because as you kind of pointed out earlier, things work, but they work inadvertently, right? So there needs to be just as a taxonomy of failures, there's kind of a taxonomy of what works in line with what was predicted and what the things are that may have led to that are not as intended, right? So if you have both complement each other, you're way better armed to understand what it is that you're trying to do when you go and trial it in the real world.
And I'm fascinated by your depiction, particularly, governments come to mind, but you can make the same criticism of business as well. This sort of narrative of success. And we see, there are certain political leaders who have never made a single mistake ever under any circumstance. Or if they've made a mistake, it's the sort of the same process you go through when you have a job interview. What are your weaknesses? And it's secretly, it's a weakness that's also a strength, right? So in other words, no admission of any fallibility. Yeah. And I think so you've almost picked on a broader societal point there that sort of says we don't seem to be very good. And we're not encouraged by the leadership that we see to admit mistakes, because inevitably, whatever you're doing, whether it's a behavioural intervention or you're building something, there is the risk of things going wrong. And often we're not faced with perfect choices of sort of, you could have done course A or course B, and you chose A, and B would have been the right answer, and A was clearly the wrong one, right? There's a massive amount of nuance here, and it might be A to Z choices, all of which have pros and cons. But you've kind of alighted on a dynamic that is difficult to admit you've gone something wrong, particularly when there's a huge amount of scrutiny in you. And I guess that's where it leads to in sort of the public life, where people don't want to admit they've made mistakes because it's seen as a sign of weakness.
Yeah, but the thing is, that's a kind of internal insecurity that people have, right? So the actual, if you want to actually draw on psychological evidence here, and just as an aside, I think calling myself a psychologist is not something that's terribly fashionable these days, because everyone sort of, sticks behavioural in front of everything. It's like, we're psychologists, right? It's not, there's nothing, it's not dirty to sort of say that. Anyway, that's just another kind of pet peeve. I've seen this recently, which is like behavioural nudges. You think, well, what else? And this appears in the most kind of reputable papers as well. And, when I say paper, in the actual newspapers as well. But anyway, so as an aside. So if you look into the psychological literature about, what people consider, how do people use cues to judge credibility? And this is kind of particularly in the area of psychology, which is called persuasion kind of literature. There's a lot in there that sort of tells you very interesting things about what people look to publicly. And they kind of, the population would tend to kind of say, well, okay, well, this expert seems much more credible than this expert. Or this business seems more credible than this business. And actually, when things don't pan out as expected, and you gain actually more credibility by admitting that you got something slightly wrong. So as long as you can explain what it was that you said that might have been wrong, right? So if you just say, "Oh yeah, I got it wrong," there has to be a qualification of that. The other thing is in the world of business, right? So let's say you put a product on the market, and actually there's something wrong with or food or whatever it is, right? There's something out there, and you have to recall it because there's some problem with it, or the production of it and so on means that there's kind of, I don't know, it contains something that actually has to be recalled because it exposes the public to risks. Now, there's an issue, which is that this can backfire on the business, and it kind of has reputational costs. Actually, it's not. It's the opposite. Once the business sort of makes it clear explicitly that this is what's happened, and they're doing everything they can to protect the population, that can actually in turn sort of lead to much more sort of judgments of credibility and attributions of reputation, all of the kind of good things that you want out of it. Once you admit the things that have gone right, so if you fess up and you explain, okay, well, this is why, and this is what we're trying to do to prevent that from happening, to protect you. That it just seems like a risky thing to do. And people are incredibly reluctant to do that for whatever are, internal insecurities that they have. But the evidence sort of points in the other way, which is usually with, some exception, admitting failure is, and the same goes with me, right? So, I've run a whole load of experiments and published them, and people could try and replicate them. And if they're not replicable, then, in some cases they haven't been for whatever reason. And I end up working with the people that have actually shown this. So, this didn't work. You think, well, great. Okay, well, let's work together and figure out what the reasons were for why it didn't work and why you weren't able to replicate it. And we can advance knowledge in that way, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you can profit from it and not in a strategic kind of way. Right, so not in a cynical kind of way, in a way that actually just generally benefits everybody else. So I think you're right it feels like there's so many things at stake at the moment that no one's willing to say that things, sometimes they've got things wrong.
Right.
Which is odd because intuitively, we kind of all know that humans are fallible. Because we all screw stuff up on in my case, probably minute by minute, but let's be generous, say hourly basis, right? We're all making, often piss poor decisions. And sometimes it's even things that in the moment we know are stupid. It's not just a case of looking back on it. So I find it fascinating that there's something built into into all of us that we know we're going to get things wrong. And of course you get great comedy out of that as well. So again, we know from one of the, what it is sort of what comedy is often funny because we recognize the fallibility and they're just showcasing something that we'll intuitively know. So I find it really interesting that we sort of, something that we all inherently understand kind of then gets translated, I guess, as we grow up and become adults. There's an expectation of sort of perfection and that we don't show any of these things.
Well, I think so the other thing is that, on a day-to-day basis, we might also not want to sort of, it might seem like we're humiliating ourselves if we actually say that, we've done something wrong. But let's say in high-stake situations where, let's say a policy decision might not have panned out the way you wanted and, it actually was the wrong decision to make. People will be very forgiving of the fact that the motivation behind that was good, right? So, and then the moral psychology literature has a lot to say in that, on that particular issue. But let's say actually, well, this is where, people are incredibly sophisticated in the way that they read intentions and motivations in the actions of the people around them. So if you attribute, some, positive intention that people had, then again, people will be forgiving of that much more if they think that it's asymmetric. So if you had a positive intention and actually whatever you did actually led to some sort of failed outcome, people will treat that very differently than if people perceive that you had a bad intention but the outcome was good, right? So it's actually in general preferable the other way, like the first way. So the reading of intentions, because we're as social creatures, we're designed to look for these things because you have to try and figure out what it is that people are doing, why they're doing them. So that's why causal explanations really matter, right? So if the intention behind something is an indicator of the motivation, the causal factors behind it. So if you
hence you get manslaughter versus murder. As an example.
For instance. But I mean, that's quite an extreme.
I've just deliberately got extreme, right, to prove a point. But
Yes. So, but anyway, Oh, well, okay. Well, so this is maybe. Right. So let's take this into a context which is actually very live, which is another area of kind of my interest. And it's kind of considered an intervention, which is unconscious bias training.
I'll bring this on. I'd love talking about this.
Well, but this is where it becomes right. So the literature that I know, there's a kind of running theme with me here. So the literature that I know tends to show, one, it doesn't work, and actually, if anything else, it can backfire. Right. So if you mandate unconscious bias training, then it has backfiring effects. Like people, especially aggrieved. But here's the thing about how it connects to what I was saying about intentions, right? So we're in very dangerous territory if you say, okay, well, you're behaving right, because there's an assumption that your unconscious attitudes are the things that might drive your behavior. And the problem is that you don't actually have conscious access to those attitudes or beliefs or biases. And so, you're kind of bumbling around in the world, kind of doing things. that could be bad for other people, and so people will read in malice as intentions, but you're kind of stuck in this kind of weird space where you think, well, I don't even know because I don't have conscious access to those things. So what's going to happen is I'm going to use a very leaky test, which is the implicit attitude test, which has a whole host of problems associated with it, to then reveal to me that actually I've got these kind of latent inherent biases, and that's and I need to address that. So you think, well, then you're in a worrying sort of situation. You think, well, do I know my underlying intentions, and does this mean that people are kind of reading intentions and making moral evaluations of me that I don't have actual conscious access to? And I can only understand them through these kind of, very poor techniques. Right, so that presents an incredibly live problem because, there's judgments that are being made about something that's going on unconsciously and the behavioural outcomes, which you don't have control over or access to. So my assumption is actually that's the evidence for one, these things being unconscious is the jury's out on that. The tools themselves are problematic, and the training methods are often fail. Right, so then you think, well, okay, well, again, let's show some epistemic humility here, because we shouldn't be making these kinds of moral evaluations about people on the basis of unconscious intentions. Right, so if you want to start evaluating people and making moral evaluations, then base it on things that you can attribute to what they're doing consciously, not unconsciously, because no one will ever win. Right, so if you want to make any effective changes, maybe make those changes given the assumption that people actually can control these things, not sort of go to kind of unconscious bias training soothsayers that are going to tell you, oh, no, I can tell you all of the unconscious things that, are going on that you don't have conscious access to, but I do, and I know. But it's such an awful minefield that I'm not surprised that actually people are very worried about what the implications are for that. But what I can tell you as a scientist in the area, that's interested in this area, is that the methods and the training techniques are, from a scientific perspective, very problematic, and this is an enormously unregulated area, right? So there's no standard technique that is out there.
I find it fascinating on two levels, which I'd be interested to get your views on. The first one is that if you do that training, it positions it like you've got a people problem, and you can kind of then not have to look at your organizational structures, because you go, what we're doing here is we're cleansing the people of these impure thoughts, and we're going to help so that we can solve the problem that way. And we don't have to look at the structural issues that might be there. And then the second bit I think is interesting is, if you carry it to its logical extremity and you sort of say, okay, we want you to conform into these, then you're going against, in some respects, some of the principles of diversity that you also want, which is you do want people to think in different ways. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to hire in a bunch of racists in your organization, but there is an interesting piece that sort of says, well, if all these things are some of the things that come in unconsciously are what make people different and diverse. And if you just approach it and say, we need to look at all these unconscious, but then you're also neglecting the fact that in some cases, some of these things are actually beneficial from a diversity perspective. So for those two reasons, I look at it, I'm a little bit skeptical. I wonder what you thought.
So I have to be careful here, because I'm not saying that there aren't biases that exist. That might mean that we behave in ways that we should sort of keep in check, that can be consequential. So I'm not denying that. I am incredibly skeptical that these things have an unconscious basis to them, because unless you can actually demonstrate that reliably, and given the replication crisis was actually the result of trying to show that some of these processes are unconscious and reliably show that they're unconscious, is an issue, right? So so that's one. And also the unconscious bias training kind of industry is the gift that keeps on giving, right? So you can say, oh, well, it didn't work this time. So what you need to do is have another training session.
Let's double down on the thing that wasn't working.
No, you company X can cough up, yet another sort of chunk of money to put people through this kind of ridiculous training program. The thing that's interesting about it, because I've gone through these things myself a couple of times and not necessarily gone down very well with the people that are trying to train me, which isn't a
God, think why.
Is that actually they inadvertently are racist, right? So if or inadvertently, whatever it is, right? So it's funny that actually, that it's not just because they're doing it through illustration, right? You think, well, actually, the thing is that you're presenting biases that I had no concept of. I'm not even I'm not aware of them. It's just they don't come to my mind. They're totally irrelevant to me. So you're creating an issue in some cases that just doesn't exist, right? So you present, here's a racist issue, or here's a kind of misogynistic issue that exists. Well, that's not it. And you're right in that actually some of these things address very seemingly cosmetic problems. That's fine if you want to just say, well, look, we've ticked the box, we've done this. We've done the unconscious bias training, that's it. No. If the thing is, here's another way to put it. Which is where it shows its inherent inconsistency. So if the assumption is any unconscious process that we have is often, if you go down the kind of fast and slow kind of distinction, these are based on very kind of entrenched experiences that we've had, which have built over time. So they're almost habitual and they're automatic. So why would it be that, a half-day training course is going to compete with, the best part of 20 years worth of an entrenched bias that you had towards someone? Like, there's just, to put things in that kind of context. So it's doomed to fail from that point of view.
It's hilarious though, because you're right, because if you think about, I don't know, alcoholism or diets or any of these things, right? We don't just rock up to solve that problem by having a half-day training. So why do we think it works on a cognitive level?
Yeah, so no. And as I said, when actually there's kind of very, very nice published literature that shows actually that if you've trained. So the other thing is how you evaluate the training program. So you can say, now that you've done the implicit attitude test, so that has to show, reveals, you said you weren't biased at all towards, women. But now it turns out you're a sort of inherent misogynist. And you think, oh my God, this test shows that I am, and I so definitely need to go on this kind of training thing. So then, the measures of success are, well, how do you feel about that? Did you learn something? You think, I suppose, right? So that, if you actually look at metrics along the lines of, what you pointed out, two sort of critical issues, like this kind of addresses one of them, which is you say, okay, well, this was the training that was introduced. What are the actual measurable objective outcomes? So, for instance, how many women were nominated for particular prizes in that organisation? Did it make any difference to the number of nominations? And it doesn't. Like, so, on objective metrics, there is next to no evidence that shows reliably these things actually make meaningful systemic changes. Like, assuming those actual problems exist, and by what magnitude, these methods don't work in actually meaningfully changing them. Right, and I think I can say that relatively confidently, and I will show some epistemic humility here myself. Right, this is based on my reading of the literature. Now, I'm likely to have missed an awful lot of other literature that might show up otherwise, but given what I understand about how unconscious processes work and the problems with the methods that are used, that those are the basis on which I'm actually making those evaluations. So, I could be shown otherwise, and I could be persuaded otherwise. In which case, great. I'd love to see that. But on the basis of what I've reviewed as a literature, those are the conditions that I've set. How reliable are the methods? Finding the things that they're saying they are, so that they're valid. And then second, are they reliable? And on those kind of criteria, they are not either of those things.
What do you see as assuming you agree that there is a problem there, that there are, that sexism and racism does exist, how do you think we should start trying to solve the problem?
In the last few minutes we have.
Yeah, totally.
Solve that massive problem. I think I think the thing that I would say here, which is possibly not something that's either that palatable or satisfying, is in the same way as I would have said with the nudges, which is that you can't use the same. You can't use the same technique to address what is a very complex problem, because you think, well, let's say, can that unconscious bias, again, let me sort of say, I get why that might be used as a technique, right? So you just generally want to help make people aware of these things. So fine. I think the way they go about it is sort of ridiculous sometimes, but let's say even if that was successful, that you can't use that alone to solve the kind of complex issue that exists, right? In the same way as if you're trying to reduce alcohol consumption, or you're trying to increase people exercising more, one method isn't going to be enough. Like, so in the context of trying to reduce smoking, right? So to the extent there are any successes that exist over time, so the actual kind of drop in uptake of smoking, and also just general smoking cessation, it globally was never just as a result of kind of horrific pictures on cigarette packets, right? So that's not the only thing. It was useful, but in conjunction with taxes, like bans, right? So, very heavy duty regulatory instruments were used in conjunction with soft behavioral measures, right? So if you want to go through trying to deal with an even bigger, more complex issue, then just using one intervention isn't going to be enough, because it shows, in the same way, there are multiple factors that are going to have to be taken into account, which can't be all singly addressed with one intervention. So again, as I said, it's either not going to be palatable or terribly satisfying to.
No, I think that's incredibly palatable, because I think actually one of the challenges here is that people kind of become aware of behavioural science, and then they sort of go, here is my toolkit for dealing with it, and it's like, I'll pluck this one off the shelf, and I'll use this, and I'll take something that I've read about working in this context, and I'll ignore the fact it didn't work to 100%, right? But I'll presume that it'll suddenly work to. So I think that's actually a really, really powerful point there, which is actually to get these things to operate. And this is where I think your research is interesting. Often it isn't going to be one thing that delivers it. And therefore, you need to be thinking quite cleverly. And therefore, I think a creative approach to this stuff that says, actually, let's have a look at all of the levers we might pull, recognizing that every single lever we pull will have unintended consequences. We may not realize. And I think that's a really powerful message, actually. So I love that as a closeout. So far from being a ridiculous question, you've actually brilliantly distilled, I think, the way I would look at sort of behavioral science interventions, which is don't just rely on that one thing. Think about a range of different and recognize that there will be side effects. And if you start with that piece, that is not your clue to solving the problem, back to your earlier point. But that is a great way of starting because you give yourself a fighting chance of at least trying to address it. How's that for a conclusion?
Yes. I think, and one other thing, the final note on this, which is, I think, if you want to, and this is my general shtick anyway, because this is, where I come from in terms of my research on control, self-control and agency, which is if you hand over agency to people, because that's a fundamental psychological experience that we have, like we need that to operate. Because there are devastating effects to our mental health if we don't feel we have control or agency. So similarly, it extends to these kind of other very serious social issues, which is you assume people's agency and control. So if you say this is all unconscious, you strip that away. So what control do I have over these things? If they're not consciously accessible, they're automatic, and all of the other kind of baggage is associated with that. Some of these, let's say the vast majority of these issues are things that you can know that are attributable to you. You are responsible for these things. And so, to the extent that you want to change, those things are also consciously that you are consciously responsible for and that you have agency of. So if you take that away, then we end up with very disastrous situations.
Wow, there we go. Look, amazing. I could listen to you going on forever. Unfortunately, that's not an option because time has got to us. But listen, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thank you also for publishing the research and being a voice in a slightly different direction that I think is super healthy and fascinating. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading your research, but also having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Magda for appearing and to you for listening. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You'll be able to subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. Any listeners who like the show and have the opportunity to leave a 5-star review on the platform they're using will be hugely appreciated. It really does help. I'm releasing more frequent episodes of the podcast as we near the end of 2020. So stay tuned to this channel for some fabulous guests coming up within the next few days here. In the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.